right, welcome back. This is Halcyon at RSA 2024. We're sitting here with Glenn Chisholm, the co-founder of Obsidian Security, as well as the former CTO of Silence and Telstra. And you've been all over the industry, Glenn. Thanks for being here. Thanks for coming on on our show.
Thank you for having me, Ron. Appreciate it.
Fantastic. So we've got a couple of quick questions for Glenn here today. Now, SaaS misconfigurations, let's just start there. Along with kind of stolen credentials, there's still a huge issue for companies to manage and get under control. What are your thoughts on it? What are companies not doing, and how can they improve in those areas?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, you go back to 2008, people really didn't fully appreciate the scope and the nature of the endpoint problem, endpoint being a fantastic insertion point for attackers, because everyone in the enterprise touched that endpoint. Everyone in the enterprise was using those endpoints. So it became a great way for an attacker to gain ingress to the endpoint and be able to move around the environment. I think you start to see changes. CrowdStrike comes along, Silence comes along, Carbon Black comes along. It changes the way we think about how to secure the endpoint fleet, and makes a real difference. I think when you look at SaaS, what you realize was you've had this incredibly large set of data. You've had this sort of the same set of patterns, a large number of users. In fact, the entire enterprise touching SaaS. The difference is that instead of it being a physical device, the target is the identity. The identity becomes the key measure to be able to move. And so for an attacker, they can gain entry to an enterprise by targeting that identity. It might be credentials, but it also might be stealing the token, attacker in the middle. We've seen a sort of significant proliferation of this with very public, very, very visible breaches. And so what it really comes down to is the attackers see success in that space. They have the same sort of advantages they have that where endpoint was, say, 10, 12, 14 years ago, where organizations haven't invested. An IDP is not a security tool. It's an identity tool that's focused on productivity. People who build IDPs have got a natural tension around wanting to think about this idea around how they can deal with security. But at the end of the day, productivity and simplicity is going to win. And so for us, being able to protect that identity becomes core. Configuration of the SaaS apps is key. I think where configuration becomes a bit of a confusion for people is when they went into infrastructure as a service, they saw a huge number of breaches from misconfiguration. When they started to understand that SaaS was becoming a real pain point for them, when they started to see these complex breaches, they think that configuration is going to be the same sort of primary issue that it was in infrastructure as a service. But configuration in SaaS is default closed. In a SaaS application, when you get it, everything is shut down, turned off, inaccessible. When you move into AWS or GCP or Azure, everything is default open. It's accessible. It's up to you to build perimeters, shut things down, tighten the environment. So configuration is not the same first order issue. It's crucial, it's critical to be able to deal with it. But, Obsidian gets involved in working with our IR partners, with people like CrowdStrike, people like Kroll and others across hundreds of IRs. And what we'll tell you is the configuration in SaaS is probably about 15% of the source of those breaches. Whereas if you look at the numbers around infrastructure as a service, it might be 85. So this is an inverted problem space. The identity becomes core to that rather than just configuration.
Fair enough. Well, you've been here for a few days at RSA itself, and obviously you've been around security for quite a while. Security goes in trends and in cycles. What are some of the ones I think that are worthwhile focusing on for this year here at RSA and in security in general?
I mean, I think the reality that we're seeing is that identity has become, a very key topic. We're seeing a lot of conversation around that. I think obviously we're seeing a lot of conversation around artificial intelligence, the way that impacts people's security programs, the way people think about that. And then, why do you care about artificial intelligence? Well, you care about it because it relates to the movement of data. Am I losing data? Is data moving outside my organization? How do I think about this data problem? Security for the sake of security is a foolish endeavor. security to secure what matters to you is what we should all be doing. And what matters to us is systems that are required to make the business run and systems that hold our data. That's how we should think about it. So, being able to get away from whatever's shiny and new and focus on what truly matters.
And for the broader world, I think AI is a newer term, but for security, it's pretty old at this point in time. 10, 15 years ago, we were using AI and ML to train defensive models. Obviously, the rise of ChatGPT and LLMs are kind of what's introduced the broader world to concepts of AI, and we have seen attackers start to use these tools, predominantly, I think, in business email compromise and in phishing attacks to maybe increase their efficacy a bit. But I'm fascinated by tools like WormGPT that allows for kind of malicious code use that would be not allowed on some of the more generally available tools. What are your thoughts on how attackers may be actually leveraging AI in the future, as well as how defenders are too?
Look, I think I think it's fair to say Silence sort of innovated around the idea of using neural networks and neural architectures to be able to create defensive capabilities, to be able to think about protecting an organization from attacks using sort of a different way of achieving that outcome, and it was exceedingly effective. With the change that we're seeing now, we're seeing a lot of interesting sort of complexities. I think absolutely the ability to be able to take sort of an LLM and to be able to build a Copilot-like model to allow attackers to be able to innovate, build malware, build attacks, that is concerning, because what it does is it democratizes the ability to conduct attacks, and sophistication can become greater from less sophisticated attackers. However, the reality is that an attack is not just a piece of malware, it's an entire tool chain, it's an entire series of behaviors. So I don't necessarily think that it creates the situation where you're going to get the script kiddie become the sophistication of a nation state attacker. There are too many other things about an attack that are required to be there. It's not just writing malware. I do think that realistically, we should be very concerned about the idea of malicious chatbots being used in social engineering and attacks on the user population, because the reality is where people have been successful over the last 20 years, it has been targeting the user population. Sophistication of spear phishing, broader campaigns, being able to target people in new and interesting ways, being able to mimic a voice and get on a call, to reset credentials, being able to have a sophisticated spear phishing attack that isn't a single message, but a sequence of messages that can be scaled. That is going to be a much more effective mechanism. And again, it allows them to target the identity, it allows them to target the endpoint, it allows them to get resident in the organization. And that is very concerning.
Yeah. I think the future is a little bit less bright, I think, for security. But we'll see how the attackers start to leverage this, I'm sure, over the next year or two. So kind of a last question here for you, a bit of a loaded one, but as Halcyon, we are a ransomware prevention and recovery service, a product and platform. Ransomware does continue to be a pretty big part of cybersecurity. Not always is it related to phishing attacks, as we've seen recently with the movement vulnerability, a few months back, being one of the biggest widespread vectors and ways that ransomware impacted people. But is there room, in your opinion, as somebody who was a former CISO and obviously heavily involved in security, is there room for a ransomware specific product like Halcyon, or is it simply going to be solved with the more with broader adoption of endpoint controls?
Well, I mean, I think we had broad adoption of endpoint controls back in about 2005. So I don't know that you're necessarily going to get broader adoption of endpoint controls, because at this point I would say it's ubiquitous. we've had evolutions in the technology that change the nature of those endpoint controls. I think, ransomware is one of those areas where you see an attacker respond in a creative way to a set of controls that get put in place. So I think, what ransom and extortion is an interesting set of responses to the way maybe the endpoint market moved originally. What we saw is companies like Carbon Black and CrowdStrike come in and say prevention is dead. Now, I mean, this is going back a few years. This is going back 2013, 2014. Prevention is dead. It's all about detection and response. It's all about reducing the dwell time. You can't prevent anything. Silence took the opposite approach and went all about prevention and trying to prevent as much as humanly possible. So I think that given that model, the response from the attackers was, well, I'm not going to try and maintain residency for hundreds of days or extended periods of time. I'm going to go down this path of encryption and rapid time to cause pain, and then drive an economic return in a totally different way. This destructive pathway becomes very useful for them because it gives them the cleanest economic return. So I think what a company like Halcyon's saying is prevention and recovery in a set of scenarios where you have very economically motivated attackers where their return is consistent, is something that obviously has validity, because what you're dealing with here is not the generic problem of endpoint security, but you're dealing with a very specific set of scenarios where the attackers know that they can monetize something in a very, very clear way. Trying to solve that generically is not going to work, because the attackers only need to catch the edge of a problem to be successful, and you need to be successful against every type of attack scenario, from the sophisticated attacker, from the credential targeting attacker, through to sort of ransomware and extortion. So long way of saying that I think that where you have a very carefully constructed set of outcomes that an attacker knows is reliable, then that is a place where you should have a set of controls that counter that specific set of problems. And that's where someone like Halcyon can be super successful in dealing with that gap in the control framework. If you think about this from a financial services control framework, as you're managing particular types of risk, whether it be trading risks or financial exposure risks, we have controls constructed to deal with specific problems. In security, we have to take a more sophisticated view of controls that can't just be like, oh, I have something on my endpoint. That is a necessary but not sufficient condition.
Right. Sort of a one size fits all fits no one perfectly, right? For every scenario and every kind of risk category.
Absolutely. But one size fits all fits no one very well, particularly if you have attackers that are deliberately exploiting one edge in that problem.
Right. Right. And the immediate pain from that one part that they impact. This isn't like an espionage campaign that's going to be around for weeks and months. To your point, we've already seen a bunch of stories around sort of going from nothing to full compromise and exfiltration of data in 12 hours, right? Or even less. So these attackers are getting more sophisticated and do require a response of equal proportion. So with that, Glenn, thanks for coming by. Thanks for being on our video production here of RSA 2024. Glenn Chisholm, co-founder of Obsidian Security. Thanks so much.
Thank you.